Good evening, everyone, and welcome, welcome, welcome. Come on in the room. Come on in the room. I am super excited to be here on this Monday evening. Actually, it's Galentine's Day, so I'm here to celebrate with you all who are watching as we love on ourselves and share in sisterhood. So tonight is going to be an excellent opportunity for us to do that. So as you're joining us, if you'd like, you can drop in the comments to let us know where you're joining us from. I am Marcy Thomas, the founder of Brown Girl Collective, the BGC Book Club, and Live Well Sister, which is another platform. I'm actually coming to you from the outskirts of Atlanta. So our guest tonight has spent some time in Atlanta, so I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. So without any further delay, I want to go ahead and introduce to you who we will be talking to. We have with us this evening Goldie Taylor, who is a journalist, political analyst, and human rights activist. She has been featured on NBC News, MSNBC, ABC News, CNN, HLN, The Steve Harvey Show, and Good Morning America, as well as NPR's All Things Considered. She has written for Salon, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, The Griot, Huffington Post, and as an editor-at-large for the Daily Beast. A self-professed golf addict and uncommitted runner, she currently resides in Boston. So without any further delay, welcome to the room, Goldie Taylor. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Marcy. It's good to be here.
Yes, I'm super excited to have you here and was really honored to have a chance to read your book. And actually, I got an advanced copy. That's normally I show it, but my copy doesn't look like what it really looks like. Yeah. But I had a chance to read it and actually spend some time listening to the audio as well. So I have really enjoyed diving into your story.
No, thank you so much for having me. I think that this is just an awesome opportunity to connect. I've been talking a lot about the book over the last couple of weeks. Forgive me, it's been a lot.
I can imagine it's a lot.
It is the differing perspectives. It depends on who the interviewer happens to be, who the audience happens to be, as to what kinds of questions they ask. And so I can say this about it: it is good to be home.
Yes. Okay. I feel you. So I told you as we were getting ready to come on, there are parts of your story that I can relate to because we have some similar things in common in terms of the love of reading and things like that. So of course you've had a very much storied career as a journalist and things like that. So what was it that made you decide to write this particular memoir and tell this particular story at this time?
Thank you, Marcy. This is one of those stories that you thought you'd hold back for the long of your life, that I had written about civil and human rights struggles around the country, around the world for most of my career. And I'd even talked a bit about our personal family story. Talking about my grandmothers was a great joy for me. Talking about the many ways that I connected with my Aunt Geraldine over cooking. And so those were great stories for me. But every so often, a national issue would come to fore where there was something personal about our family history, about how we came up, where we came up, that seemed salient to me. And so there were times when I talked about my brother and his addictions and how it took him from us so early. He was 46 years old. Mm-hmm. There were other times when I talked about my father's murder. He was killed when I was just 5. And I wanted to talk about how that impacted our lives, the lives of his mother, my mother, his wife. And those things were important to me. But this particular story began when I was raped when I was 11 years old. Mm-hmm. And the shame that came with that lasted well into and beyond my teenage years, and that I carried through until I was nearly 50 years old. Wow. When I decided that the rape itself wasn't the story. It was what happened after. What happened in our lives to us as a family, and that I was carrying around a burden that simply didn't belong to me. Mm-hmm. And at some point, I think I decided that I wanted to just write it down. And so I wrote an initial essay for the Daily Beast in August of 2019, where I spelled out the sum of it, not being able to see a doctor or therapist or even having someone call the police. That any of those supports that we think we do today didn't happen for me in 1980. But I wanted to give some context to that. And so as I wrote the story, the essay, it published that morning And by evening time, my mentions, my direct messages, my text messages, my cell phone was lit up with other people from similar circumstances and dissimilar circumstances saying, this happened to me too, or this occurred to my sister, or my mother endured this. And I noticed one striking thing in almost all of those responses. They'd all carried it in silence. This was referred to as dirty laundry.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want it to feel or be dirty laundry anymore. I wanted it to be a story that invited other people to be their own witness. Just like I needed to tell myself what happened to me
Right.
and what we endured as a family, I wanted to extend the possibility that someone else might be able to tell theirs, that they might be able to put a burden down that they've been carrying for too long. And so it became a book. And today it is The Love You Save, just published I guess it's been 2 weeks ago now.
Right.
And I think it was almost as if I had sat down to write it again. I relived it all over again, really, with its publishing. But it has been both a joy and a heartbreak to see it on the shelves. It's not a story you want anybody to have to tell.
Right.
It is not a journey that I would have wanted to have for me or for anybody. But I think the relief for me was knowing that there would be other women, other Black women, other brown women who found safe harbor in it. And so I sit here today as someone who, well, I've released most of it, but still dealing with the messages.
Right. Just thinking about everything that you said. I mean, it's so true. To put it on paper and to then have to go out and talk about it.
Yeah.
Over and over again. I can imagine that you have to have done some work along the way just to be able to do that and to be able to share that story. But then also understanding that by you telling the story, it also is helping other people maybe to tell their stories and to get the healing that they need from whatever things it is that they have been carrying with them.
Certainly. I think the healing was key for me. If I couldn't do that work while writing, then the writing wasn't worth it for me. If it didn't open the door for other people, other survivors to find their healing, then it wasn't really worth it for me. It's hard. I've been a writer ever since I could put, scratches on a paper, right?
Right.
But it's been hard for me, ironically, to even have the story celebrated. Because it's a journey, as I said, I wouldn't want for myself or I wouldn't want from anybody. Somebody asked me, what would I want? If somebody were writing a story about me 100 years from now, what I want them to say, what would I want that book to say? And what I wanted to say is, it doesn't happen anymore.
Right.
What I wanted to say is that liberation has come. And that, the gender roles and such and biases that we have in the society, that they've evaporated, they've gone away, that the predatory nature of some folks has been erased somehow. That if we were dealing, some point way in the future, I'd want to look back and say, this was the hard part and we did better.
Right. That's powerful that you would say that. And I'm going to tell you something. I am not going to dwell on the hard part because I am all about, healing and how can we move forward. There are things in the book that are tough. So for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, as Goldie has already mentioned, it does talk about sexual assault as a young girl happening more than once. So, and unfortunately, it is a story that a lot of young girls and in some cases young boys can tell the same story of being physically abused, sexually abused. And then just the fact of how other people respond when things like that happen. Is it going to be a thing where you try to help this person or do you find ways to blame the person?
Yes. I have a turning 10-year-old grandson. She'll be 10 in April, which means she'll be 11 in a year. I could not imagine that kind of devastation happening in her life, nor could I imagine that the family that we have today, I just think that we would support her differently. And that those supports weren't available for me still has a rub for me. But when I look back in context of a mom who endured her own assault,
Right.
an older aunt, Geraldine, who's in the book, who had been assaulted herself and had a son from that rape, it's one of those things where I wanted to give the people who populated my life then, I caught them at their worst moments.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to give them the context of how they got there, why they showed up the way they did in my life, and a bit about how they showed up today, and how I am able to embrace even the people that I felt abandoned by back then, and how we've come together differently.
Mm-hmm. And for me, that's actually the power in the story, or one of the powers in the story, because there really are a lot of things that that helped you move through all of the bad things that were happening in your life, and that's where I found the hope in the story.
Yeah.
Personally, just looking at, yes, these things happened and they're terrible, and you went through a lot of things, dealing with the sexual assault, but then how you felt about yourself, how other people positioned you. Like one of the things they always want to call a little girl fast, for example, in our community.
Fast tail girls.
Yeah, fast tail girls. Even in this case, you didn't do anything. There was nothing that was done that would have justified what happened. So for people to put that label on you just as a young girl and not look at or consider the things that the boys or the men are doing, nothing happens to them.
Right.
You get put into a situation where now you have to stay home, can't go anywhere, can't do anything because they're afraid of what somebody else is going to do ultimately.
Or what position I might put myself in, or what I might lure or attract to myself, that maybe I wasn't handling myself appropriately, that maybe I caused this. I carried that weight for 40 years. Before I had to just sit myself down and look back and say, what culpability could you have possibly had at 11 years old?
None.
What could you have done to have brought that on yourself, or to have the stigma walk with you through your family life, that you'd be teased by older cousins or shunned by an aunt, or left with that aunt, by your mom, because she couldn't deal. How do you reconcile that for yourself? Fast was, and I talk about it for pages and pages about what it means, because I knew that there would be people outside of our community reading a book like this.
Right.
And I needed them to know what that was. I needed them to know how it was pronounced. It was spelled fast, but pronounced fast, right? I needed them to know what the term was meant for, and that it is never placed on boys. It's always, early teen, prepubescent girls who are accused of this kind of behavior, as if we bring these kinds of things on ourselves. I didn't really realize what I was carrying in that way until I overheard an aunt talking on the phone, and where she told someone who I'll never know, who was on the other end, that I was staying with her because my mother couldn't keep me nailed down, that I was, fast out here being beyond my years, and that she had kept me in the house, this perimeter of our yard and backyard. And wherever I went, they needed to know who was going to be with me, what time I'd be back. And that sounds like a normal thing, except when you look at day in and day out, how precious little liberty you'd have to really be a child, to ride a bike up the street, to get in a foot race with your cousins down the middle of the boulevard. I had to be home from school within 3 minutes of the bell ring.
Wow.
The bell ring, you grab your books and you run down the street to your house. And part of it was the times we lived in. We lived in East St. Louis at the very front edge of the crack epidemic, and it was burning its way across this country. And so that was the one part of it, sure. But the other part of it was, we can't trust her to bring home, not to bring home somebody's baby, that we can't trust her to stay right with her studies, that, the extra work around the house, the, vacuuming and scrubbing and bleaching down the sidewalks, all of those things were busy work.
Right.
To keep me from me. And so there was I felt imprisoned. That's the right word for it. I felt as if I were that caged bird that Maya Angelou talked about.
Right. And, there are parallels. I mean, it's talked about in some of the blurbs that people say about the book, but even in my reading of it, and you do mention, her in the book as well, I kept thinking about that and how are parallels to her story and yours. But the thing that was really interesting to me is wherein we know Maya kind of stopped talking. She shut down and didn't use her voice. Your story is the opposite. So
Yeah.
talk to us a little bit about how, you found books and literature and actually had an opportunity to find your voice in spite of these things that were happening around you.
I was at first mute where I didn't talk a lot in those early months. The shell didn't crack until the following year when I met a woman named Peggy Lewis LeCompte. And Peggy Lewis LeCompte does not have a PhD, but I call her Dr. LeCompte. And she brought me into her classroom. She quickly figured out who I was in terms of the reading and the math mind and all of these things that I could do that she had not seen frequently. And she decided to begin investing in me, handing me more writings, more books, things that met me at my point of need. She handed me Maya Angelou. She handed me Nikki Giovanni. She handed me Margaret Walker's For My People. She gave us Invictus by William Ernst Henley. She gave us Twain and Homer, the Iliad, and all of these other pieces of literature. She helped me take a deep dive that I hadn't taken before. I'd read, but hadn't taken a deep dive into James Baldwin. And in those writings, I saw a reflection of the world around me that made it all make sense.
Mm-hmm.
In doing that, she had me writing essays, and soon there were speaking competitions. And she was clear. You have a voice and a story to tell, and you ought to tell it. And so it was with her prodding, her pushing, and even her demanding that I get out and, at least begin to recite some of the poetry that I'd been reading that reflected me so deeply. She gave me other pieces that were spot on, but it was she that pushed me into speaking competitions. And then I started winning almost from the start. I was winning by ninth grade. I was beating high school seniors and meeting who was the mayor of Chicago back then, Harold Washington, who told me I talked a lot. Imagine that. Imagine that.
There was a reason.
Imagine that. By the time I got to Harold Washington, I'd been talking, shouting when I had to. But that was a real release for me. Some kids played basketball and they were really good at it. Jackie Joyner Kersey was from East St. Louis. She ran track and she was known the world over for it. My gift was these dramatic interp and extemporaneous speaking competitions. My gift was essay competitions where I would just win. And I think it was a release for me when all the cousins around me had all these sports skills, right? I could shoot a basketball, but I'm very far, right? I wasn't a very good cheerleader, though I was one at one point. This was the talent that I'd been given. Mm-hmm. And LeCompte said it would be a sin for me to keep it to myself.
Right.
And so that started what has now been a 30-plus year career as a journalist. That is what kicked off. If I can blame anybody for me spending all that time on CNN or MSNBC, I can blame Peggy Lewis LeCompte. So that's where she helped me to discover the voice that was always there.
Right. And that's just really powerful. You discovered your voice by, reading and ingesting the words of others. You can see by looking behind me, I love to read. And, one of the parts of the book that I thought of myself was the reading books and writing reports, because my father used to make me do that. Yeah. We're probably in the same age group, but I was like wanting to read Right On magazine and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. And my dad was like, put that crap down and, and I want you to go read Tale of Two Cities and write me a report. And I was like, ugh, I don't want to do that.
Well, if you write on another wall, on the back of another envelope, on somebody's notebook, I'm going to see about you is what my aunt would say. I'm right. And so there was, I was reading, this is the family lore that by the time my mother and father made it back to East St. Louis from Chicago where they'd moved, I was living with my aunt early on as well. When she walked in, I was reading the Jet magazine and reading the weekly ticker, which turned out to be my favorite thing.
I remember.
And bold-faced names and such, and reading store signs and billboards and whatever else there was that had a printed word on it that I taught myself from watching public television, until my aunt decided it was time to put me in school.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be in somebody's schoolhouse. And so I was among the first Head Start students in the country. But I say all of that to say, the book, yes, is about me and my journey, but it's about all of the public structures
Mm-hmm.
that we've chosen to break down, that we've chosen to let fall, that we didn't find were important, underfunding of Head Start, being among them. That some of the resources that I had available to me aren't available to children today. That many of the resources that we should be available maybe to children were never available to us living in East St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the larger part of this was, sure, my test scores were exceptional, but I was not. There
Right.
were other students who were equally, if not more, committed to embracing what they were doing. They were in the midst of their own fight. All of us brought another story to Lecomp's classroom and Mr. Forehand's classroom. We all had stories at home. Our class was full of kids who were in foster care, kids
Mm-hmm.
who had 15-year-olds who had 30-year-old mothers, 14, 30, 29, 30-year-old mothers, was a deal. So everybody brought something different to the class. Some of us did exceedingly well. One of my friends went on to be president of the National Bar Association.
Oh, wow.
Doctors. One of them was the first PhD in coal mining in Pennsylvania. There were just students who did exceedingly well. But the grand mass of us, 7 out of 10, didn't make it at all.
Wow.
That I've got 3 grown children and grandchildren to worry with and joy about. They aren't here to see their children. They aren't here to meet the grandchildren they might have had. And so my story really is not so much about being special or exceptional, but there were many of who never really ever had a chance. And that's on us as a society. That's on us. And so I spend a lot of time talking about social structures, a lot of time talking about public education, environmental racism, gun violence, sexual violence, and casual cruelty. I spend a lot of time talking about the pathologies that I think still live with us today.
They definitely do, as because you're thinking this is like in the 80s and we're still dealing with a lot of these things in terms of our educational structures. One of the things I was thinking about, for you, and you already kind of mentioned the educator that you had who was sharing all these books and things like that with you. Today, it would be a different story because they're looking to take our stories, our history, banning books. Some of the same people that you were reading are people who are now being banned.
They're all on the list. Every
Mhm.
single person I listed today is on a banned list somewhere in this country. That someone would think that taking Ta-Nehisi Coates out of a classroom is the right thing to do. That's a moral question. That someone would think taking Nikki Giovanni or Maya Angelou out of, a junior high school classroom is a moral question to me. I know that that little library that sat inside of Peggy Lewis LeComp's room, inside of our homeroom, in Florida under the current law, she would be jailed with a felony.
Mm.
Who didn't cover it up, put it away. If she handed any of us those texts, that she would be held criminally liable for it. Not civilly, but criminally liable, that her career would be ended. And that's the shame about where we are today.
So, as members of the community, parents, things like that, what do you think that we can do to circumvent some of these things or to really fight against what's happening in the school systems around the country?
Every parent isn't able to give their children these things at home. My uncle used to take them. He used to work as a concierge in a high-rise building in St. Louis near Forest Park. Glorious building. He used to bring home paperbacks that he'd get in the lost and found, the hand-me-down, wherever he could find them, or from the gas station he worked at. He'd bring home. He brought me the autobiography of Malcolm X on one occasion. He used to call me the absent-minded professor. Every parent doesn't have that available to them. Every parent isn't literate to begin with.
That's
So
true.
we depend on our schoolhouses. We depend on teachers to do, really this job. But if we're jailing them, if we are passing laws about what they can or can't do, then that's a school board. And you can see who's lining the school boards today.
Mhm.
That these activists are running for and winning these small races so they can control what happens in our classroom. The only way we get to fight this is that we begin to line the school board dais. that we begin to be take positions of power, we can make decisions about what happens in our children's classrooms. That's where the seat of power is. It is hard to ask folk to run for public service today, seeing as how public servants are treated in this day and age. But our children are on the line where these school board races are concerned. And so if I could encourage anybody to do anything, it would be to run yourself, recruit others, and spend some time making some decisions about our children and show up and show out.
That's one thing I was going to mention that I do, at this point, I don't see myself running for office per se. However, here in the Atlanta area, there's a program called Everybody Wins Atlanta. And basically it's going out into the schools and spending time reading with children to help with their literacy so that they can learn how to read. And one of the things that I always do, and I'm currently doing my sorority, we're donating books. Yes. And the books that we're donating are diverse books.
Absolutely.
To make sure that some stuff is getting into those schools. And, there are books that go on like book carts that we can actually read while we're there. But then there are also books that kids get to take home. So that's, my small part. And,
Absolutely. That. I think that I've seen a study just here recently about the number of words that children show up to kindergarten with. And there are some students who come up knowing 100 words when they get there. There's some that come with 3,000 words. There are children who show up to kindergarten with 25,000 words in their vocabulary. You can tell at that moment how they're going to do in the second, third, fourth, fifth grade. That by third grade, we know if they're going to graduate high school because they're either lagging so far ahead or lagging so far behind. So, early childhood literacy is where the game is. That 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, and they get to be 5. It's almost late to learn to read by that time. And so literacy is a key to this, in that children will begin self-selecting when they've got that power. They'll go to the public library, they'll select their own books. They'll go to the local bookstore, they'll begin selecting things that are at their level or higher if they can put, their minds around it. And so early childhood literacy really is a key to this.
Right, absolutely. And that is something that I did growing up in Cleveland, Ohio. I would go to the library and get books, sometimes big stack of books. Just
I wouldn't take them back.
Right. I remember seeing that in your book as well, not taking them back. But I want to shift gears just a little bit because, of course, we talked some about your mom and the relationship that you have had and continue to have with your mom, just based upon some of the things that she experienced and how she, dealt with you according to her thoughts and feelings. But then also you have this wonderful aunt that, even though she might have been tough at times, Aunt Gerald really kind of took you under her wing. So talk a little bit about those women, those powerful women in your life.
I say in the book that my mother was the kind who did her crying in the dark. That she didn't like to show folk her weakness. When she needed to fight for us, she would. I mean, there were times when she had to pull out the arsenal to go after some folk on our behalf. But then there were other moments when the world got too heavy for her. And she lost her husband. I was 5, so I guess she was around 33 at that time when her husband was murdered. And she struggled with that. She mourns him to this day, and she's, over 80 years old now. But back then, my mother was focused on working, putting those nickels together so the lights stayed on, or that we had food to eat that night, or that we had shoes that fit. She was focused on that work. My aunt was a homemaker. My uncle, who worked at the high rise and at the service station, he worked full time around the clock so my aunt could stay home and raise children. And she raised everybody's kids. Right. It wasn't just me. It was other cousins and step cousins from around the corner that wasn't really cousins. Right. I mean, everybody had a place in her house. But she was angry. She was an angry woman almost all of the time, benevolent in ways that she would feed everybody, but would wake up mad. We would be on the receiving end of that, throughout the livelong day. The two of them over time were just nearly raised together, best friends. The two of them, they were peas in the pod, and they really did complement one another when it came to raising the children in the family. When my grandmother passed, they became the family's matriarchs. I tell people that we are a family of women that there aren't in my immediate family. Brothers passed, fathers passed, grandfathers are gone, uncles aren't living anymore. That in my immediate family, the oldest man in our family was born in 1986, my nephew
Oh,
C.
wow.
And so these two women really were in charge of this entire, network of a family. It was a big burden for them. And looking back today, I don't know if I would have been able to endure it. I consider myself a strong person. I think I've come through a lot of things, but when I look at what they had to navigate from day to day, casual racism, the 70s and early 80s, that losing their sons, having to subsist, on the margins, in the ways that they did it in that America, I don't know if I would have survived it. I would have wanted to burn the whole thing down. But they did it with as much grace as they could muster. My aunt's answer was faith. She buried herself in a Bible. She was in church 3 and 4 times a week, taking all of us children with her. My mother buried her sorrows in her work. And so they had different addictions. One of them was religion and the other was work. For me, as I said, looking back, I don't know how I would have managed the struggles that they had with so many mouths to feed, so many needs to answer every day, and never, ever having the time to tend to their own.
And as you're saying it, I was thinking, well, you know what? Those things are still happening today, even though we may have different things available to us. There are a lot of women who are still burying themselves in their church or their spiritual, home, or burying themselves in their work. It's something that continues to happen. And, as far as we've come, it's still a struggle for many of us.
I've never seen any of this comes to mind. We had bathtubs. I never saw one of them take a bubble bath.
Wow.
Like, close the door and I've got the bathroom to myself. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to light some candles. I'm going to open some wine or a beer or whatever they had. I never saw them once engage in some self-care, some renewal time. Because frankly, there just wasn't a free spot in the house for them to do it.
Right.
My aunt's house was never empty. There's always somebody making noise, doing something, right? Such that my aunt, in her own home that she and my uncle owned, it really wasn't hers. It belonged to whoever swung through the door next.
Yeah, I think some of that is people felt this obligation to family in a way that maybe some people still feel that way, others don't.
Social adoption is common. I'm raising my granddaughter today, but social adoption among us is a common thing. And there's rarely any paper involved. I mean, today, people go to court to get guardianship or custody. But back in that day, you just dropped your child off because you needed some extra babysitting time. And, you didn't have money for a nanny or any of those other things that people afford today. And so you did it the only way you knew how. And that meant your grandmother sometimes helping to raise your babies because you had to work the overnight shift at the 7-Eleven. My mother worked as a cocktail waitress for Marriott Corporation, worked nights. And then she left there and went to another cocktail waitress job overnight so she could make enough money to pay the rent. But who was with the children? My aunt was with all the children.
Right.
And so, they traded off in that way. But again, never saw either of them engage in a moment of self-care.
As someone said, yes, the village, absolutely. That village concept was strong. Yeah, just thinking about that. But you also had another grandmother who lived in Florida who had a different type of life. So you got a chance to see two different things.
She had a very different life. I got to see life in a couple ways. There was one in East St. Louis. The sound was generously, it was bottomed out, that no industry left. A few convenience stores. There was a McDonald's on the corner and a Wendy's later on. But there was very precious little left in the town. In St. Anne, there was a little more. There was a dance studio, there's an ice cream parlor, there's a drive-in movie theater. There were open parks and the public pool was clean and everybody could get in it. And that was different. But Miami was a different story altogether. My grandmother and grandfather, my paternal grandfather lived in a solidly middle-class neighborhood. Next door neighbor was a judge who was my grandfather's best friend. He was the first Black judge in Florida post-Reconstruction. His name is now on the Federal Center in Miami. Miami-Dade Federal Center is the Lawton Thomas Federal Center. My grandparents were members of Boulay and Guardsmen and the Girlfriends and all these other elite social clubs. You know, they didn't eat canned food. My grandmother liked, peeling her own mangoes. She made apple pies from scratch, made lemon key lime pie from fresh squeezed limes, those kinds of things. And so down to the food was different. We didn't have special towels in the bathroom. You used the good towels. And so that spoke to the kind of living that they had, that they owned their home and their cars, and they expected me to go to college. No one mentioned that back home in East St. Louis early on. They expected that I would leave the house well appointed, that I would be selective about my friends and who I was with. I saw the ocean for the first time. My grandmother wouldn't let me get in it because she was sharks and jellyfish, but I saw the ocean for the first time. Even going to church was different. I call them the frozen chosen. So they were living a very different kind of life than I'd had back home. And it gave me a perspective on what life could be. I wanted to take my culture with me, but it gave me a perspective on how I'd want to raise my children, what I would want to be able to give them, and that it would take me working hard to ensure that they had this kind of future, the future that Catherine and Roy showed me was possible. And so the life was quite different. It wasn't just dinners, but it was an open emotional avenue for me. I could talk to Grandma Cat in ways I couldn't talk to my mother. And Cat would understand and embrace that. There was no having to sit down with Auntie Geraldine about anything. You had some other things to do. Children are to be seen and not heard. Well, Grandma Cat wanted to see and hear us. And so for her, I was something precious, whereas back home, I was one of many and I was an obligation.
Just think that was actually a blessing for you to be able to see and to understand, what was possible, because I think a lot of times we grow up in spaces where we only see one thing, or maybe what's on television, which isn't always realistic. And so we don't understand. And one of the reasons why I started Brown Girl Collective years ago, it was to show people differences. For example, a lot of the history that I've shared over the years, that we can see, okay, back in 1900 there were Black women becoming lawyers, all these different things. So that, hey, if they could do it during that time, there are things that we can do now. We don't have to feel like we have to stay in a particular box. So I
think at every point, no matter how they were living, at every point people deserve a point of respect. And that poverty isn't a moral question. That my uncle worked day and night on that working poor job that he had. But his dignity, his sense of self-respect, all of that was intact. That he carried his head as high as my Grandpa Roy, who did very much better in terms of wealth in his life. That, while the circumstances economically were different, the moral fiber was the same.
Still good people regardless.
Yes, they're still humans regardless. They didn't like each other.
They didn't like each other. Yeah, you talked about that a little bit. I guess sometimes, the one who has everything, like, well, why don't they do more? And sometimes
true in our family today. That we still have those kinds of divides. But my Aunt Gerald didn't think much of Grandma Catherine, and basically said, white folk gave her a couple of nickels, and she thinks she's rich now. And my grandmother Catherine didn't have much regard for Geraldine. Said she was mean, called her a bully, those kinds of things. And so that fighting went on until both of them passed away from this earth.
Wow. Yeah. And like you say, it can definitely happen within the families and things like that. So when you discovered, we talked about your love of reading and books and all of that. I think it's very powerful that it was a lot of Black literature. So what was it about James Baldwin specifically that made you fall in love with him and his work?
Well, he was making my world make sense, as I said. He talked about the addicts on the corner, the glory and the frailty of religion, the love between folk as it stood, right? Meeting people really where they were. He talked about poverty as an act of violence, and those things. He was crystal clear about what it meant to be black in this country, and he was giving nobody any breaks for that.
Mm-mm.
And so, as I looked around East St. Louis when I first arrived, I thought these people just don't want anything for themselves. And then I read Baldwin and more Baldwin. And what I figured out is that there were traps set, such that those who wanted and did more for themselves, that they had to work not twice as harder, but exponentially harder to get just the basics met for them and theirs. And so Baldwin right sized my world from this highly myopic thing that, you know, as I said, I thought people that didn't have anything must not want anything.
Right.
Baldwin showed me that there were other forces at play that stretched well above and beyond the people who were living in it, and that there were fewer controls over your destiny than we that I had accounted for in my young mind. And so there was a growing up in reading Baldwin.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking about that. There are oftentimes things that keep us from being able to move in the way that we want, even when we have the examples.
Right.
Sometimes it's just more challenging,
Yeah.
with
I mean,
systems.
if you can see it, you see it's great. But what if the school around the corner is broken?
Yeah.
And you can't get to any place better. It's broken because the tax base has been eroded by economic and white flight, and that your schools just simply don't have the kind of funding that's necessary. Or maybe your housing stock is broken. We lived in homes that should have been condemned in East St. Louis. Over time, they were and were cleared away. But, why were those homes in such disrepair? How did it get that way? I began to want to know. Baldwin made me want to know why things were the way they were, why the wealth gap existed the way that it did, why there was hyper policing in our communities as opposed to maybe some others. I had real questions, and Baldwin was answering so many of them.
You just said that made me think about an article I saw you wrote not too long ago about, what's been happening in the news lately with the hyper policing, and the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's a count that breaks my heart almost more than anything else. That part of the construct of keeping these communities contained is mass policing in non-white communities. And that when we look at where policing came from, why it is the night riders, in slave era America, that when we look at how young black men and boys are treated as suspects when they wake up in the morning, that was true with Tyree Nichols. It was true for Rodney King. It was true for the young boys that grew up in our neighborhood, and true for my mother and her brothers when they were growing up. And so not a lot has changed about that, but for the proliferation of cell phone cameras. Well,
Right.
now we can see it. But, there are a few reforms that I think have made a real difference. Chokeholds are still used in many of the 18,000 police forces across this country. Stun guns are used as non-lethal weapons when we know that they have the ability to kill. That traffic stops with no probable cause, like Tyree Nichols, that they are prevalent in almost every city in the country. Stop and frisk is still the law in so many of our cities, far too many of our cities. The school resource officers in schools, or predominantly black schools, that black students are more likely to be suspended, expelled, or jailed for the same offenses that a white student may commit in a suburban school miles away. And it is not just the over-policing of our neighborhoods, but our children, and the kinds of penalties and stigmas that follow them a lifetime. And so that was true for us in East St. Louis, true for our children today. And so in so many ways, too little of it has changed.
Yes. Yes. And, just in reading the book, I definitely could see the parallels from then to now. And I know, yeah, I mean, there's just so many things that we still just need to be aware of. And as you were saying earlier, being willing to, whether it's run for office or, go to the meetings or whatever it is, making sure we vote, all these different things that we can do to make a difference. Sometimes we think that it doesn't, but the more we show up and show out, eventually they're going to have to listen.
Eventually. I was in Baltimore after Freddie Gray. I went to North Charleston, South Carolina, and walked the steps, Walter Scott's last steps, through that open field where Officer Slager chased him through. I've been on the scene far too often to recount a case of mass and over policing that ended in the death of an unarmed Black man. And it's a scourge for us. It could have as easily happened to my brother. My son was accosted in Atlanta by Atlanta police a few years ago, but for a crossing of the stars, he could have been a Tyree Nichols on that pavement. There's just so much of it, and that's just one issue. When we look at the hypersexualization of our girls, pervasive in our popular culture today, that it is normalized, that Black women are treated the way they are in popular media. I did a study for Essence in 2007. It was an Essence Procter & Gamble poll of Black women. And one of the things that I found in that study was 77% of Black women say that they are more negatively portrayed in popular media than any other demographic. And we are. Even though we are the most highly educated demographic, that the vicious stereotypes and hypersexualization that we see in popular media doesn't reflect us, but it reflects the stereotype that what people want them to believe about us. And unfortunately, it's something that we sometimes buy into. And I think we ought to own our sexuality. I am one of those folks that, it belongs to me. I can do what I want to do with it. But when people begin to use it as stereotypes to degrade and malign and to lock up and lock out, then it's a problem.
It most definitely is a problem. And, I'm just always mindful as well as, yes, the things that happen with young men and older men, but also with women as well, being sexualized in police situations or, things like that. So things happen to us as well. I think of Sandra Bland, what happened to her, and there's so many others.
There was a young girl just recently, tape came across Twitter, and she was in the middle of a mental health crisis, darting in between cars, and her mother had been called and others coming to her rescue, and police had been called because they were afraid she's going to get hit. Officer doesn't treat it as a mental health situation, he treats it as a criminal situation. He has her pinned down in a highly sexualized position, where her hands are not able to move and straddling her in such a way that it was sickening to watch. But it reminded me of McKinley, Texas, not more than 5 years ago. 17-year-old Black girl out swimming in a neighborhood pool. Police officer does her the exact same way, tosses her around like a rag doll. So it is not just Black men and boys, but it is our girls as well. And I don't see that has changed at all from decade to decade. The only thing we get to do about that is hold our public officials accountable, that we show up to the town hall, that we show up to the city hall meeting, that we show up on Capitol Hill, we push for laws for accountability, things like qualified immunity where police officers aren't held responsible, personally liable for their actions. I think they should be. I think if a cashier at a store, took the cash register and hit you with it, he's personally responsible for the damage that they do.
Right.
I think officers ought to be held personally responsible. I think they ought to do away with qualified immunity, but they also ought to codify in law the duty to intervene. Standing by idly.
Right.
As another officer, engages in an unlawful attack, the other officer should have a duty to intervene. That isn't law today in far too many places.
Which is unfortunate, and why a lot of these things just continue to happen, because they're not going to stand up and do the right things.
Right. They're afraid of stepping on the other side of the blue line. That what will happen to them when they get back to the squad room with the other officers, and how they might be maligned or marginalized or pushed out. They're worried about their own careers. I said that the officers involved in the Tyree Nichols case, they were too busy worried about putting their story together. Too busy worried about their tomorrows, their families, their futures, than the boy that was dying laying against a squad car, that he was in the act of dying. And they're worried about, did he get any blood on my shoes? And so those are the kinds of things that, the kinds of issues that I attempt to raise in the context of my own story.
Thank you so much for, for doing that. And as I was saying, I definitely can see parallels. Like, yes, it's your story and it's a very personal story. But there are also things that go across the board that we can all kind of cause us to think about and figure out what we can do to perhaps bring about change.
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. And that's really why I wrote this story in this way. I didn't tell people how to feel about an issue. I raised them, and I raised them one after the other. I wanted people to see the human condition clearly, and what level of culpability we all had in it.
Absolutely. Well, believe it or not, our time is almost done. It doesn't seem that way, but we've had such a good conversation. I do have a question for you.
Sure.
Why the love you save?
Well, my mother will tell you, she'll say that I've been pissed off since 1973. That's my favorite phrase. And my older brother, Donnie, came in and he wanted to watch something on TV on Saturday morning. I was missing my cartoon Jackson 5 show. Because, Randy Jackson was going to be my husband. I was sure of it when I was 5, right?
Yours too?
I was sure of it. And so this was my favorite show. And the Jacksons were what I was raised on. They were accessible to me in terms of, they looked our age. They looked like us. They were superstars. And so went to see the Jackson 5 concert. And that was one of the first songs that I heard Michael Jackson sing in live. But when we started to write this book, we went through a number of titles. It came down to, I could be angry. I could spend the next 50, the second half of my life, being angry, burning it all down, seeking revenge upon anybody who's still living, who had any part of this for me. What is more important for me is that piece of love I saved for myself and for the people who populated my life. And so when my Aunt Geraldine passed a couple of years ago, broke my heart in pieces. She died in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I miss her grumpy little voice today. Even though when I look back at my early life, I saw her as a sheer I hated to hear her call my name because I knew there was trouble. But at the end of her life, that's all I wanted to hear. When she could barely speak, I just wanted to hear her selfishly call my own name. And so for me, the most important part about this journey is that I am still able to love and love freely and with clarity. That I'm still able to get punch drunk, crazy in love. Despite all the ugliness, despite the muck and mud, that I'm able to love clearly. And so for me, the most powerful part about my life is indeed the love that I saved.
Yeah, I got it. All that, yes. That's it right there. That there's so much power in what you just said. As I figured the Jackson 5 reference because as I said, we're about the same age. So I started to put that song when I posted on Instagram. I started to put that song.
I think my sister's still angry that she had to take me she was 7 years old, and she had to take her little sister along with her to the Jackson 5 concert. I think she's still mad. But I got to see the Spinners and the Commodores and Frankie Beverly, all these things because my sister was a teenager. But every time my mother bought a ticket for her and my cousin Janet, little Goldie had to go right along with them for the night. And, she's, now 60. I think she's still a little mad about that today.
Wow. Well, I do have to tell you a quick Jackson 5 story because my mother was the one who would take me to all the concerts. And I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and they came to this theater. It was called the Front Row, which is one of those theaters in the round.
Yeah.
And we went to the front row, and we happened to have seats that were like right at the edge, right? So, we saw the Jackson 5. And I was in love with Michael, but then later on, Randy, when he joined the group after Jermaine left. So we were like sitting on the edge where they actually had to run up to go back to their dressing room. And Michael was running up the aisle, and my mom was like, touch him. I was like, oh, I don't want to touch him. She grabbed my arm and stretched it, and I touched Michael Jackson on the arm, and I was freaking out. He said, oh my God.
They were truly icons for us.
Yes.
They were our superstars. It
Yes,
was nice to have
absolutely.
them on that stage back then. They were truly our own superstars. They belonged to us.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. So, yes, so that's my Jackson 5 story, concert story. So, I really thank you. We have a comment here from Paulo saying, "Thank you for an excellent, interesting, thought-provoking discussion." Yes. Yes, it definitely was. And, unfortunately, like I said, I showed the cover earlier, but
I think
yeah, mine isn't that. You have yours so people can see, they go look
I
at it.
have just a few back here, right?
So yeah,
So,
I said I'm gonna go get one that has the actual real
yep,
cover on it.
cover.
But
Um,
I really did get a lot from the story. I enjoyed reading it. I just felt like, things that I could relate to because we are in the same age range, the things about, you and your reading and your writing, the fact that you weren't athletic and I'm not either.
I have no rhythm, couldn't dance, none of those
All
things.
those
My
things.
only saving grace is that I could put two sentences together. I could string sentences.
Right, absolutely. All right. Now, Mocha, do you have a question? Because I don't know if a hand is raised
That's a
or
hand.
just saying amen, or if you got a question, please drop it in the comments. We can get to it before we get ready to go. But yes, I'm just super excited to have had the opportunity. Uh, checking from New York. Okay.
And there's a Statue of Liberty down there. I see Lady Liberty down there.
Yes. Okay. So checking in from New York. Okay. So, of course, your book has only been out for a couple of weeks. So you are doing tours and things like that.
I was just in Brooklyn.
Okay.
Louis. We went to DC, Atlanta. We were just there last week before
Yeah, I
last.
missed you here.
And we're at the Atlanta History Center. But I am. I was here at Harvard. I am next on The View. And so I'm home for a little bit, but we will do The View on February 23rd.
Okay.
So I hope everybody will tune in. We can thank our sister friend, Sunny Hostin, for, endorsing and being behind this book and worked so hard to get us a spot on the show. And so I'll join them on February 23rd.
All right. Well, I'll definitely be on the lookout for that as well. Since I missed you when you were here in Atlanta, I don't know what I was doing, but I wasn't able to make it. But
I'm in LA, I think, in April for the LA Book Festival.
Okay.
Festival books. I'm there. So other tour dates are coming. I imagine we're going to come back to Atlanta. We had such a wonderful crowd this first time. I have a feeling that we'll be back in Atlanta again soon.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's kind of sort of an old home for you, a former place that
I lived in Atlanta 35 years. It's still home.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. It's like second home.
It is still home. I've lived in Boston for just over a year.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So ATL is still home. And I've only been here a couple of years, so I'm still working my way around.
Atlanta's still very much home for us. I raised my children in Atlanta.
Oh, wow. So everybody, as you can see, all of Goldie's places where you can follow her and keep up with what she has going on. They have been scrolling the whole time. So I hope you wrote it down, grabbed it, whatever you need to do so you can keep up with what she has going on. And, once again, I just want to thank you so much for being here. I hope that this won't be the last time we get a chance to chit chat because I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was terrific. And thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight.
All right, then. Well, if you can hold on for just one moment so I can say a proper goodbye, but I do want to go ahead and let everybody know what's up next. So just hold on 1 second.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. And Goldie, once again, it was a pleasure to have her here, someone who is well-versed in journalism, well-versed in her own story, of course, and just has so many things that she can share with us that we can take and learn from. So for next week, our book is going to be Wade in the Water by Nyani Nkrumah. So she will be here next week on the 20th. Oh, I know it's a little glare there. That's a little bit better. So she will be here next week to talk about that. And in 2 weeks, we will have Tracy Rose Payton to come in and talk about her book, Night Wherever We Go. So we've got some good things coming up. And this is just finishing out Black History Month. I always got stuff coming down the pipe. So just stay tuned because I want to say I've got authors lined up all the way through May at this point. So yeah, there's a lot of good people and I'm always looking for new and wonderful writers to come on and talk to us. So thanks again for joining. Please share this out. This is an important conversation. Make sure you go and grab a copy of Goldie's book or listen to the audio. It is available as well. So thanks again for your time, everyone. You have a good one, and we'll see you again here real soon, hopefully next week. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.